Very good.
Right. Shall we start then?
Sure.
Go, go, go.
Yeah. Okay. So just to recap what I was saying previously. So in this session came to be because we've had a few sessions in the this week where we're talking about Wardley maps, and particularly we wanted to explore even before the summit how we could potentially portray maps risk on maps, and how we can use Wardley maps to map risk basically. There are still a couple of questions on potential ways that we can approach it. So one of the things that we're talking today on the Slack channel is we can potentially think of it in 3 different spaces. So risk to an organization, which potentially would make it difficult depending on what are the elements that we would put on the map. Another way to look at it would be risk to a value chain. And that sounds like it's easier because we can have our value chain in a map, and then think about the effects of risk and how to overlay risk information on it. Or a third potential way would be to look at risk from a component perspective. So depending on the value chain, look at each individual component and what risks that particular component may be exposed to. We didn't have many answers, but on the Wardley Mapping channel on OSS, I made the suggestion we should look at one of them to see if we can kind of focus on one thing, so we can get some outcomes to share at the end of the session. And because we have not many people in the room, so it's 9 of us. Maybe I'll start by asking the question. So we have one of two options. We can either all have a conversation, 9 of us, it's not many people, so I think we could make that effective in trying to explore risk to value chain and focus on a value chain. I'm going to share my screen and then we can work from there. Or if there are people that would like to explore both risk to a value chain and risk to particular components, then maybe we can break out into 2 rooms and explore them separately.
I think
Yep.
most of us are not as advanced as you are. Who would say they are quite advanced in the mapping practice? Anyone other than Mario?
Yeah, and even the Mario. Let's go with that. Okay. So I suggested that we all stay in the same room and let's have a conversation about mapping. So actually, just before we start, can I assume that everyone knows the basics on Wardley mapping and have attended the sessions this week on Wardley mapping, or have prior knowledge of it? Or better yet, does anyone not know anything about Wardley mapping?
There's one person who says they don't know.
Andrea. Okay, so going into kind of the basics of Wardley mapping would probably be challenging and not add much to them to the overall stuff. But I'm going to talk generically, and just when I explain the value chain that I have, hopefully that will give a general overview of what that is. So let me start by sharing my screen. Okay, these are too many screens. Okay, you're seeing my screen now, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Miro screen.
Yes, Miro. Yeah, I like to use Miro because it has a template. So if you've got a Miro account and you come here to templates, you can choose Wardley Mapping Canvas, and you've got a template that you can start with straight away. So obviously I skipped a bit of you can have, what you should do is go through the items one by one from 1 to 6. yeah, I kind of skipped those stages and went straight into the map. After you start mapping for a while, that's kind of what you tend to do. So what we have here is based on something that would probably potentially give you a kind of an introduction to it. But I wrote a few blog articles about 6 months ago, I think, where I went through FAIR. In one of them that I'm going to share this on chat, I particularly used maps throughout the article, basically to think about the evaluating loss magnitude using FAIR methodology, which is a quantitative risk management for information risk. And basically what I've done was we have a value chain, and I tried, this was my first attempt at trying to portray risk on a map, and this was the risk of business disruption based on a ransomware attack, and what were the different teams and the impact. So in this case, the ransomware attack would affect the collaboration drives, and that would have an effect both upwards towards the value chain. So the different teams that used things that were using that collaboration drive and up to the storage level. So what I did kind of today, an hour ago, something like that, was to try and translate that type of value chain onto a Miro board. So this was done using MapScript, and it's a way to create Wardley maps programmatically. You can go to mapscript.org and you can create your own maps programmatically if you want. But I kind of translated that here so we could kind of collaborate more easily on it. So as I mentioned, if anyone wants to share their email address, I'm happy to share this board with you. But let's start from the start then. Usually what we have on Wardley maps is at the top, we start with users and user needs. So in this instance, what I've done was I started with the users are these three teams. So we've got a sales team, fulfillment team, and an ops team. So the actual scenario, I've explained it on the article. So what I shared the link is of series 5, and it starts at 1. So the actual scenario I explained on the first. Actually, let me just share that if you then want to read about how the thing came to be. So you can kind of follow along. And I've done, I tried to do a very good job of trying to explain the different scenarios and why the value stream, the value chain ended up looking like that. But if we focus here now, so what happened is we have these three different teams. They have some needs in order to perform their services. So the sales team needs to manage customer relationships. The fulfillment team needs to fulfill customer requests. The ops team needs to schedule customer deliveries. So the example is based on using OWASP Juice Shop, and I kind of invented a company that was basically juice shop that made sales of juice to customers. So what happened here is we've got the teams, we've got each of their needs, and in order for them to perform their function, so the customer relationships, to manage customer relationships, they need to have access to order data. In order to fulfill customer requests, they need to have access to supplier requests. And also customer requests. Yeah, they need their own suppliers data so they can fulfill their customers. And to schedule customer deliveries, which is done by the ops team, they need access to delivery scheduling information. Right? So all of these teams, they use desktops when they're in the building, and it's assumed that they it's assumed that they will also have ways to access the environment remotely, right? But they have some desktops in the building, and both the laptops and the desktops have access to some collaboration drives, and it's in these collaboration drives where we've got all of these different pieces of data. And this is also used on, this is all stored in the same storage space, which is on a server room. So in this instance, this company is not using cloud storage or anything like that. They use storage products, and they host their system inside their building. So they've got a server room with with a service. So this is kind of the scenario. So here we've got just as brief introduction to Wardley mapping. So all of these things, they are custom built. So this order date and supply requests, let's say they're more like, they look more like spreadsheets than or things built internally. This delivering scheduling, even though it uses data from the collaboration drives, is actually a product. Okay, but all of these use the same storage, and it's a custom built server room. Right, so these are the different aspects of the value chain. So what I have no idea. Avi, he will be coming in soon. I think he had some more ideas on how potentially to talk about risk in terms of let's use this value chain as an example. But one of the suggestions that I came up with was instead of necessarily thinking about risk throughout the whole chain, we could have a representation of the type of risk that that we're talking about. In this case, business disruption and ransomware. And what I've done here was using the structure that is behind bowtie diagrams that we've talked about earlier, and which is everyone familiar what a bowtie diagram is?
Bowtie diagram, is that the infinity thing?
Maybe not. So this is what a bowtie diagram is.
Okay, mind map. Or, no.
Okay.
No, I don't. We don't.
Yeah, so this is something that Phil Huggins has been talking about in his risk sessions as well, and I've started using with some of my my clients as well. Basically, it's a way to think about risks in a different way. So in the middle, we were going to have. Actually, I'm sure they won't mind. We have. In the session earlier today about the diagrams they were using. Okay, sorry. No,
You have a very clean history.
Yes, I do. Okay, I'm not seeing it now, but let's go with this example. But we have a few that Phil Huggins. Actually, it's on Slack. Sorry. So let me just bring that over.
So I have a question with this one, because we're talking about the event, but we're calling it risk. So that suggests to me we haven't had an event. We are analyzing it as if it would happen. So as a risk rather than an issue.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So this is an example of a filled-in bowtie diagram that Phil developed. Yeah, it doesn't have the best thing, but let's go through it instead of a theoretical example. So in the middle, we've got the risk event itself. So we've got a supplier information breach. And the way bowtie diagrams work is that to the left, we're going to think about the different controls that we have in place and what are the ultimate consequences of that those controls are trying to protect us from. Okay, so in this instance, we've got a supply information breach, and we've got particularly on the top one, we've got a WAF that isn't very good. So it's a red control. So we do have it, but it's not well configured, whatever may be the case. We've got SIEM, but it's also not very well configured. We've got SDLC, which is in a slightly better space. And we've got patching that we are actually doing properly. So all of this could help us protect against a vulnerability being exploited that would ultimately lead to a system intrusion. Okay, and the same thing for account compromise. So we've got in this instance incident response lock and change playbook. We've got SIEM. Again, it's the same thing, but it's in a different type of scenario that it's protecting us from. We've got a dark web intelligence that we're not getting much information on. So, and we have multi-factor authentication. Right? And the same thing across all of the other ways. So social engineering could also happen. We've got here staff awareness, email filtering, that type of stuff. So to the left, we're going to have all of our controls and what are the consequences that they're protecting us from. To the right, what we have are our mitigations. So if the event does happen, what are the mitigations that we have in place to either contain or reduce the harm that we could suffer from that type of event. So in this instance, in order to protect us from a regulatory fine that would happen if we were breached, that could happen if we were breached, we do data protection impact assessments, we do supplier assurance, and we have an incident response process, which is kind of not so good. In terms of damage reputation, we've got a comms crisis playbook, so our boards know what to do if that comes to be. And if we were to lose the supplier because of supply information breach, do we have a backup supplier, or do we have a good onboarding process to quickly replace that supplier if something was to happen? Does that make sense, the idea of bowtie diagrams?
I love it.
Yeah. Okay. So what I tried to do here was, and I really like that because it also enables another thing, which is if a lot of times it happens that organizations tend to treat each of those things. So the risk of, it's not a risk, but they call it the risk of malware infections, the risk of system intrusions, the risk of social engineering, and they treat them as separate things, and you end up having too much paper and no real value added by managing so many pieces of paper, let's say. So here it kind of forces you down the route of aggregating those as supplier problems, related problems, and it also allows you to to have less pieces of information to manage, let's say, whilst still doing very good risk management.
Are we going to use this event as our example for the session?
Yes.
May I add something there?
Yep.
From experience, after a ransomware attack, we used pen and paper at our sales offices because systems, we didn't want people to use systems for contamination.
Yeah.
So we started.
So I actually thought about something along those lines, but I didn't know how to express it. So this is the other example that I did. So here I was trying to think about the disruption to performing that particular activity. So for instance, what I tried to do here with the thickness of the bars is that this fulfillment request would be completely broken because there's no backup plan. But here we would still have kind of a plan B, so it is disrupted, but not as much as this value chain.
Okay.
But having it as a separate item, maybe that's a good idea. But there would be. So what I don't know is how I would kind of frame that, because for instance,
that would be for the sales team, and it would be in the commodity to use.
Yeah, let's add it for the time being. But I'm not sure, because the challenge I have with that is that it would overlap with information that is already summarized in here with this approach. So we would be ending up having duplicate information on the map. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure what you really mean, because I don't know what those.
Yes, exactly. So what I was thinking in this example is that following the ideas from the bowtie diagram, I was adding here without any of the detail. So the detail would be either a submap or something along those lines. But I could see here that I've got lots of controls in place. Some are green, some are yellow, and I've got some red ones. Right. So I do already have some things, but this on mitigations, I have some good mitigations and some mitigations that aren't that good. Right? But what I don't have is the detail on what those are.
Okay.
But
So
because this was just kind of exploration, right? That's what we're doing here.
yeah, and we're all here to
Yep.
discuss it.
So what I don't know is how. So I would, what you're saying as having a backup plan
It's
would certainly
not as
fall.
a backup plan. That this is not even a backup. It emerged as the backup plan at that moment. But this was for to be able to take new orders.
Mhm.
We deserted to pen and paper. So I would probably, if this was a bow tie one,
Yeah.
I would put that as the end goal is taking new orders, being able to take new orders, and
Mhm.
the mitigation or whatever you want to call it is using pen and paper,
Yeah.
maybe.
But there would
The
still be a mitigation, right? Because that only comes into play if you were to be
If the event
disrupted,
happens,
right?
yes.
In the event that the thing happens.
True. I guess somebody wanted to say something.
Yep.
yes, Jonathan. So I like the idea of using the Wardley map as a way of thinking about risks to particular components. So the order data processing component. What are the risks to that? Because it gives you a lot of context around. Okay, if X is interrupted, it's going to impact Y and Z that are further up the value chain.
Mhm.
Putting all of the risks onto that diagram, I think gets complicated.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I didn't go down that route.
Yeah,
I agree with that.
certainly the having using the bow tie ones, being able to almost drill down on is like, okay, well, what are my risks to order data? And then you drill down into high level bow tie diagram, and then maybe you drill down again is a very interesting way of looking at it. It makes sense, but yeah, I haven't got
Another
more.
idea that I had, but I can't do it with Miro. So it would need to be done. I don't think I can do it with Miro. Let me just check. So it would be instead. Oh, but I could potentially do it if I wasn't using stickies. Can I do borders here? Text color. Yeah, maybe not with Miro, but if I was using another tool, I thought about the idea, at least from a component perspective, to potentially color code the borders in a way of to highlight the not the amount, not necessarily the amount of risk that that asset or that component is exposed to, but the overall risk versus control landscape. Is it something that is exposed to a lot of problems that we don't have appropriate mitigations for, or something along those lines? But I'm not sure how that would look like, or even if it makes sense. Because the challenge overall, I think, is that the drawing a value chain on a map is already something that is going to add lots of elements on a map. Trying to add potentially all types of risks as components in a map or threats that can potentially materialize, make the risk materialize, that would make maps unreadable, generally speaking, my gut feel.
Because you already have an x-axis, adding something on top of it is quite challenging, because then it's almost impossible to put stuff.
What happens if we redefine the x-axis? Take some of the stuff that Dennis has talked about and use it as a way of viewing risk. So just to keep things nice and simple, let's say our order data process is high risk because we know that our various controls and mitigations aren't set up. Moving that to the left on the map then gives you a visual view of where where your higher risk components are, the relationship within the value chain still exists because that's on the y-axis. Obviously, you then have to map all of the information underneath into something that could be represented on the x-axis. But yeah, it might work.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have seen other maps where the x-axis has been changed to be something else.
Yep. So there was the part that I still didn't even think about, which was what would being in a stage 3 for a risk actually mean, and what would that what that could be. In terms of the evolution itself, I'm less concerned, at least at this point in time, on actual words, but even thinking generically, what does stage 1 and stage 4 actually mean? Right? Is it something that I'm more exposed to? Do I have good controls against the risk? Or, do I have appropriate mitigations? Does it mean both? Yeah, I didn't get that far.
Mario.
Yep.
Sorry, Jonathan.
No, go for it. So I said because I was thinking rather than I wanted to talk. Please go ahead.
I can I just replay to you what I'm seeing and the value I could see in it. I'm seeing an embedded bow tie diagram at the top that ideally would be drillable to look at the detail.
Exactly.
But the detail from that you'd pull out to the front here is the preventative controls. You would overlay the preventative controls on the components of the business process that it's potentially disrupting. And you would put both the preventative controls that partner with the elements that they cover and the components at the level of maturity you've got. So, because I mean, you can talk about the level of maturity of the control and the level of maturity of the component it's protecting. That's going to inform conversations about how easily you could recover it, whether it's a commodity that you can just buy and replace if it breaks. But I mean, this is all spitballing what I'm seeing.
That's a really good idea. But just bear in mind that from the bow tie diagram, it's not just about the controls. So the controls are the kind of the line to the left. We also have the mitigations. So after boom, if something happens, can we recover? Do we have all those other things? So it's a combination of both.
Yeah, but the relationship is that you look at how much risk you've got remaining with the maturity and usefulness of your preventative controls to inform how much you then invest in your. Sorry, I've gone on mute. Oh no, I'm not on mute.
I'm not sure I followed.
Okay, so if I was looking at something in the way I've just described, I would be looking at how mature and how useful the preventative controls are in context of how disruptive they are to my process and how effective they are at mitigating risk. And then I would look back at my bow tie diagram and say, okay, so how much do I need to invest in my response? Because there's only so much I can do with my current maturity and without stopping the business doing business in the preventative space. I think I would struggle to represent both those things on the Wardley map though.
Yep. No, I have to agree. And even if we were to think, so for instance, here we have a bunch of controls. Some are green, some are yellow, some are red. Even if we were to take the view of trying to overlay that on what they mean to the components, we would still struggle because we potentially, as that example bow diagram that I showed, even that one, which is not very complex, we are talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 13 controls that I'm counting.
Okay.
So overlaying them over the top of each component would be very challenging.
Yeah.
And in that bow tie diagram, it didn't have the residual risk or the inherent risk rating, anything like that. I don't remember seeing that.
No. But personally, I'm not a big fan of qualitative approaches.
But But even if it did,
yep.
Let's see, we have tested all our controls for their effectiveness, and we know some of them are effective, some of them not so much.
Yep.
But if the ransomware attacks happened and it was successful, then does it really mean much at that point how effective those controls were? Because it happened.
Well, it does. Okay, so for instance, if we take a compliance approach to it, an information breach isn't necessarily a regulatory breach, right? Mm-hmm. So just because you were hacked doesn't mean that you didn't meet GDPR requirements, right? You may have all your controls in place, you may have done everything right. It was an incident that happened. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to separate the two.
But something must have enabled that. Maybe it was the seam. It didn't alert us through all the cyber kill chain. Or it was the patching. We thought we were doing great, but we were only scoping our tests for servers that were after 2000, Win 2000 and stuff. I don't know. There must have been some deficiency that we didn't focus on. Anyway, cool.
I'm a little, I'm still pretty new to Wardley maps, but with the going, if we're looking at, I look at them as a, or I've been led to believe they're a tool for communication at the very highest level. So with, in terms of the risk part of it, being able to, well, whether you want to do qualitative or quantitative with risk, showing where we think we are on the map, or the position of sorry, brain's not working. Taking our order, taking some concrete examples. If our order data process, we consider based on the set of controls that we have, and I'm speaking both controls and recovery, that is our highest area of concern at the moment. We would want to, or we could use the map to start discussing, okay, well, this is the area that we believe is the highest risk at the moment. How do we move that to the right? Or if we're representing risk in some way on the graph, but also post breach or post incident, you can come back to the map and say, okay, well, we had a breach in, let's say, storage, but storage was a low level, we had it represented as a low risk component. What did we miss there as part of the post-incident review? Mm-hmm. Does that give, or can you throw in when you've got other breaches externally? So, you know, lessons learned from, say, Equifax, et cetera, can we use lessons learned there, or methods or evolutions of attackers to look at the impact across our value chain and what that might represent? Again, focusing on using this as a tool to drive conversation.
Yep. So
that makes sense.
Yep. So there are two aspects, I think, to what you're saying. So on one hand, we looking at it from a regulatory perspective, right? So something like the British Airways on Equifax breach, etc., or Dixon Scarphone, once they come up with a ruling, when they say this is what happened, these were the criteria that we found they weren't good, right? Then at that point, we either have regulator action, or if it gets challenged, case law, that tells us this is the thing that that we would expect companies to be adhering to. And then at that point you've got something to something that is more tangible in terms of what it is that that had an impact in making your fine bigger, let's say, or making it a worse problem. For instance, the Dixon Scarfone fine, I remember that there were, in the report, it was mentioned that they weren't meeting their own policies, that they didn't have incident monitoring for the store systems, for the in-store systems. So there are a couple of things in there that tell you the regulator didn't see this in a good light. Right, so it's no longer just about generally following or not following the standard. Is the regulator said that this is a problem, right? That they should have been doing this. So at that point, I think it does generate what you were saying. That approach, that not having those things in place, is seen by the regulator as a contributing factor to a bigger fine. Right, but how that would translate into useful information for a particular map kind of eludes me. So another way that I was thinking about it, I'm gonna just show you very quickly, is usually red dotted lines. So something, let me do it like this, has a special meaning in maps, because it means lines of future. Okay, so when you say this on a map, that component here, a collaboration drive going into as a commodity, this would this is probably the better example, but I'm going to use, oops. Why can't I? Sorry, I'm just going to create another one. So something like this. And when we say that this is a dotted line in moving to the right, what we mean is that, for instance, in this case, I would stop using my on-prem storage and I was going to move this to the cloud, for instance. So I'm moving from a product to a utility. Right. So one of the things that I thought is potentially not, but it wouldn't relate to the 4 stages. So I'm not sure how useful that would be, but potentially using a different type of color to represent some of those things that that are missing. So if we now know, for instance, we had a particular set of standards, so we knew that our gap to manage this component better was this big, but now there's been a new ruling, we found out more controls that are missing, so it's now bigger, right? But the problem is that would not relate to things on the map, so I'm not sure that would be very informative. It would be just overall a something that would be relevant to the particular component and not something that would relate to difference in stage, right? So it kind of, not sure it fits the bill.
I mean, all that makes perfect sense to me, but I'm just wondering whether we need to get assumptions out of the way. For just one that occurs to me, I don't think anybody has really properly cracked the problem of quantitative risk assessment in this kind of context. So I think it would be far too overambitious to think that a Wardley map can help solve that problem. Rather, can we only represent what we're capable of doing in the main? Maybe use it, you know, if we inform better risk understanding, we strengthen the business case to gather and sustain the metrics to then be more quantitative. Yep. Is that a fair position?
Yeah, I agree, but I don't think I was referring anything on for a quantitative approach. So this was just a kind of missing controls, generally speaking. So I wasn't particularly referring to quantitative or qualitative methods.
It's interesting. Sorry, go.
Oh no, I'd finished. I was just acknowledging it. I was kind of gone off at a bit of a tangent. Mario was absolutely right.
I think those lines imply a position on the bottom relative to, I'm just going to say, a high, medium, or low risk. So going back to the redefining the x-axis to be something different, such that if there is a if things need to move from or are missing controls, then that gap between, you could say, accepted and not accepted, it could be binary, or is those lines imply movement left to right based on increasing or decreasing requirements or increasing or decreasing risk, be it fines, regulatory, etc., etc. So asking it the other way around, is there value in the Genesis custom product and commodity when we're using this map to talk about risk? Or are we more interested in the various components that make up the value chain as a representation of the business as a whole?
That's a very good question. Avi, do you have any thoughts on that?
Hey all, sorry for jumping in late. I'm still trying to play catch up, understand what's going on. I do have one comment though about the qualitative, because the great thing about qualitative is that we know the numbers are accurate, and we'd like to get to the point where we have the exact numbers, but that would fit a spreadsheet and not a map. And I feel like the whole thing about map, I think Jonathan was said about relative, it's not supposed to express the exact values. It's a model, and it's supposed to be relative, and trying to go in the direction of even something like qualitative, I think, is the wrong usage of maps. I think we want to abstract all of that away as much as possible, and explicitly go in the other direction of not being qualitative. That doesn't mean we need to be quantitative, but it does mean that we're focusing on the relative positioning. Does that make sense?
And yeah, it does. And I think just to add to that, I think I in particular, but we need to be conscious that there's an element of inherent risk on the Wardley map itself. Right? Something that is in Genesis is inherently more risky. Right? Whether we're talking security risk or any type, it's inherently risk, right? Because there's uncertainty. There's it's going to fail. We don't expect it to work as much. So there's an inherent. By looking at a map, everything to the left is inherently carries more risk, okay, because of the nature of what it is. And something that is to the right inherently carries less risk, right, as a result of that. So when that's something that I still haven't completely figured out in my head as well, because we're trying to overlay a very specific type of risk when in the Wardley map itself, there's already a view of inherent risk of the thing.
I think that goes back to what Phil was saying yesterday. Risk. what is risk?
Yeah.
In our conversations, we're really talking about security risk, which is very different than risk of failure. Is there less risk for a completely commoditized S3 account that is left open on the internet with blank credentials? That's not a lower risk, but it's completely commoditized.
The component, that's where we should separate the inherent risk of the component in the risk to its use, right? The risk of the component is very low, right? Because in order for you to, and it goes back to the shared responsibility model, right? In order for a company like Azure or AWS to provide a commoditized computing service, they need to have the processes in place where there are very few outages. They have automated testing to ensure the stability of the service, and you get that because it's a commodity service, right? But if we think of it from a shared responsibility model, it doesn't mean that the customer is not going to configure it wrong. And if the customer does configure it wrong, that's different. But that's where I would separate what is the component itself from what is the activity relating to that component. Right? So if I'm starting to consume cloud services and I decide to use S3, then my component itself, maybe it's a commoditized component, but my practice relating to that is in Genesis, because I don't have in-house the expertise to use the service efficiently, right? But that's where I would map the two types of capital. We've got one thing is the component itself, the activity. The other one is the practice relating to it.
Would it be too controversial to suggest that cloud providers are not yet commodity, because you still have to do lots of configuration yourself? There's still a lot of burden on you to make it secure. It's not.
I would disagree with that.
I think what Mario says is a perfect answer there, though. The product they provide is a commoditized service.
Yep.
It's the practice around it isn't, and that's the DevOps and CD and there's there's starting to be more services around secure and automatic configuration and all that stuff, but I think Mario is right that we're not there yet. I don't think that we necessarily we don't always need to get to that level of resolution, right? Sometimes that's too granular and that might use the water sometimes.
Yep.
But sometimes you do want to split it out, so I think that makes a lot of sense.
I don't think it would be too complex to separate out the security, the security stack that goes with the cloud component.
Exactly.
As two separate things.
Yeah, the access to it is commodity. It's too easy, 2 clicks, but the security of it isn't.
Yep. So even then, I'm not sure I would agree. Okay, so for instance, if we go to, and actually let me add a new template here, because the template has all the characteristics in it. So you're all still seeing my screen, right?
Yep.
Yes.
So let me add a new canvas. Right. So one of the things here, so is that when we are focusing on the characteristics of each of the things, what we have here in terms of user perception in failure, the practices are well defined. If I go to the AWS website, I can see exactly what it takes to secure an S3 bucket. Right? It's not something that I need to come up with. I may not be following the practices, the secure practices that are established, but that's me not adopting. It doesn't mean they don't exist. Right?
So what do you think about them having new services almost every week? So that tells me it's something in constant evolution.
Not quite, because one of the things that, for instance, AWS is known for doing is they do not start development of a service that they could not write the press release for. And you can only write the press release for if it's already if it's already in this type of space. If you already have lots of products out there that define what the capability it should be providing, so they only commoditize things that are already that there's already a market for many products that are close to becoming commoditized, but they have that built into the design process. Right? So until they are in the position to write the press release, meaning they can define exactly what it does, what's the stability, what are all those things, they don't even start the development process.
Okay, so when you say AWS, are you only talking about the storage?
No, I'm talking about all of the services generally.
Okay.
Right, because they're in the market of commodities. Right? So based on also some of the stuff that Simon shared in the last few days, they only attack the markets. They've got their ILC strategy that Simon talks about. Does everyone know what the ILC thing
innovation,
is.
something.
Yep. So let me just Wardley, I'll see. It's relatively simple to kind of explain, I believe. Let's see if I do it correctly. Okay. Yeah. So this is probably the best thing it does. But I'm gonna kind of do my my explanation of how I perceive ILC to be. So basically, what it is they own the metadata to everyone that uses their service. Right? They don't have the services themselves, but when people build on top of them, AWS have the benefit of being able to use that metadata. So when they create an S3 bucket, for instance, the S3 bucket service, when they create the EC2 service, every time someone builds a service on top of them, they have access to the metadata and they know how their services are being used. So when they want to decide which areas of which next products they are going to be developing, they can look at the metadata that they already have, that they harvest from their customers, and they know exactly what is going to succeed in the market, because other people are creating products on top of their infrastructure and they've got access to that metadata. Right? And this is the type of cycle that AWS does better than everyone else on the planet. Right? They really leverage the metadata of the things that customers build on top of them, and they use that to know what the market is asking for, and they know that when they start development of a new commoditized service, they already know that there's a market for it, and they know how to reach it. Right? So, so yeah, that's kind of built into their ethos, into the way they develop their own services. But that does imply that when they start the development, it's things that are already here, right? There are feature differentiations. It's high profitable stuff, and they know how to approach the problem space.
But Mario, you seem to be assuming that security maturity is being developed in line with product and offering maturity. I mean, when Simon was doing the intro the other day, he very clearly stated that when you were looking at maturity, when it was compared to uptake, you could have something that was very immature but had massive uptake. So that was two aspects that move you around the map that are out of sync with each other. And I'm sort of challenging you that the same thing is true about security in both capability and implementation.
Okay, that's a good challenge. I think I would separate those into two parts. One of the things is the security of the component being used. And when a service is typically created by AWS, within the first 3 months, you typically have best practices on how to secure that particular component. Right? That doesn't mean that your architecture, your whole value chain, which makes use of that component, is going to be done securely. Right, that's a much bigger problem that involves not only the suppliers that you use, but also your own internal practices on how you use different components. And that's always a much bigger problem, and there's more risks affecting it outside of your whichever particular supplier you use.
Okay, so it's capability versus operationalization. Well, that's an awful word. Sorry.
Yes.
Doing it,
it's
shall we say?
Yeah. I was referring to the security of the component that they provide, right? From that point of view, I think very quickly, on most cases at least that I came up with, there is the guidance on how to secure the component. But that doesn't mean that people will use it accordingly, or that they know how to secure their ecosystem, right? Which is, for instance, you may not have a misconfiguration on your S3 bucket, but if you're not doing input validation correctly on your or on your web front-end system, maybe they're going to get to the data anyway.
So again, you're separating between the maturity of the component itself and the maturity of the practice around it. That's really what it comes back to.
Sorry,
right?
you were breaking up a bit on the voice. Could you say that again?
Sorry, some background noise. So again, this comes back to separating between the maturity of the component itself and the maturity of the practice, the organization's practice around the component.
Yes. So it's like the integration.
Correct, because that's if we look at the shared responsibility model, that's what it is, right? Up until their service layer, you've got and that's been one of the things that has I've got into many conversations on supplier assurance with many people over the last 10 years, is that when they say, oh, I need to go visit or whatever the AWS or Azure data centers, and what I usually say, look, those people get more auditors each year than we ever will, right? There's no way that any other than the three big players that you're going to have the type of physical security measures that those companies have, right? They have to adhere to standards. They show you their certificates they're audited on. They've got more of them than we as businesses, most of us will ever get, right? So it is a challenge. We need to make sure they're there. That's a part of doing a robust supply assurance process. But yeah, let's consider the actual risks, right, which are likely to be more on our side than it is on theirs.
What about the difference of maturity of the component, of the practice, whatever, of itself, the evolution, versus the security maturity of that same component? We could consider SAM or whatever. But if you ignore the security aspect, they're rather evolved, mature, but they have no security awareness. How would you think about separating that or mapping that even?
It's a good question.
I think that we're talking about risk of component and maturity, and I don't want to say that we're conflating the two, but there's definitely. Okay, I was going to say
that's what I'll call out.
Separating service and configuration is very useful from a risk perspective and from a maturity perspective on the map, to be able to say, okay, yeah, we're using S3, that's good, but our use of S3 is immature, therefore more likely high risk. But with these two, with maturity and risk, they're obviously linked. Are they always linked in the same way? So if something is Genesis in terms of its maturity, will it be from an InfoSec or business perspective much higher risk?
So many things
go into back to what risk and what the maturity is. You might have something in Genesis, but the practice around creating the Genesis, they're very, very security aware, very mature. They're doing all the right things relative to that phase, but they're still in Genesis. So I think we need to be explicit about that. And as you said, I think we are conflating the two. And this goes back again to the original discussion of risk. As Maya said, that there's still risk to the business, and that's completely separate to, the project might fail, that's completely separate to risk of attackers.
So I'm visualizing a component that's like split down the middle, where you've got a position of maturity that represents a more traditional representation of something on a Wardley map, and you've got half of it that represents whether the security capability aligns with its level of maturity, and the other half that's ragged is how well secured it is in reality, how well it's operationally being implemented. But that's a lot of moving parts, isn't it? Which is, I think, what we're wrestling with.
Yeah, exactly. But
like a secrets vault, where would you put it?
What?
A secrets vault. Where would you put it? It's not a commodity yet, but it does enable some security.
Well, that really depends.
Why is it not a commodity?
Are we talking about AWS Key Vault? That's kind of mature. I mean, it's even almost a commodity. How you use it is completely a separate question.
in the Terraform Key Vault, for instance, that would be a product based, right? So you've got in the market at the moment, you have both commodity versions of it, you've got product versions of it, and you've got people custom building their own, which probably is not very smart unless you are.
And the most common, I would say, is those that are not doing any of the above.
Yeah, say that again?
I would say the most common are those that are not doing any of the above.
Yes, correct.
My key vault, it's an XML file.
Yeah.
I'm trying to come up with an example where something is in Genesis, but inherently more secure than some others.
There's the product that somebody I know has produced where they essentially just wall off your most sensitive data. They pretty much, well, they all but air gap it. And I'm sorry I said air gap when it isn't air gap, but that's what I'm trying to impress on people, where it's new and it's still evolving and it's pretty unknown and adoption's low. But, you know, if you can't get at the data, there's not a lot of risk.
I think the level of risk compared to the evolution of components, if we ignore security evolution, I think it's kind of like a bell curve. As you're saying, those on the very Genesis side, they're not going to have a lot of business data. They're not going to have real data. It might not even be on the internet, right? On the far right side, you have all that risky data. You might have legacy components that have never been reviewed. But you know, they withstood the test of time. I think the most risky, again, that's an amorphous word for us right now, but the most risky components are going to be right around the middle, right? Does that make sense? The ones that are still changing, they haven't solidified yet, they haven't gone through a full size. Yeah, I'll do that. Does that make sense?
Yep. So yeah, that's a really interesting example, Sarah. Yeah, that's one to stretch the brain. So let me try and word it. On that particular example of a new, so let me play it back to you just to make sure that I understood. On that particular example, we would have a new capability being provided that provided a level above in terms of data separation than we currently have on the market, right? Generally speaking, that's kind of the in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one way that I would look at it is, because it is a new component, it starts in Genesis, because it's certainly made of things that are probably going to be spanning between commodities and products and other things that are custom built, right? So for instance, let's say for sake of argument, they are potentially using in their own development chain something like GitLab. They're potentially using some storage stuff from a particular cloud provider. They may be using some products like, let's say, hopefully not Jenkins, something like GitLab, something along those lines to develop their code. So they're going to have in their own supply chain a bunch of components that make up their product, that they use to make their product, right? Now, that product, because of the security, even though it's a Genesis because it's just starting, so the assembled package, it's something new, it's based on things that are further to the right, because it's built on top of those. It was the emergence of those things to the right that led to the emergence of that type of component. So from the perspective of your security program, that capability would provide a very high level of maturity to your program, potentially, but the component would still be an early stage component.
That sounds
Does that
right.
make sense?
Yeah, and I think that's why we need to be very careful and not conflate, the security maturity versus the not security maturity.
The value of the capability.
Capability, yeah.
This is a very, very interesting conversation. We're not solving the problem, but I'm loving the conversation.
I actually want to go ahead and share a map that I...
Yes, that was I was about to tell you. Let me stop sharing my screen. You had something to share.
Yeah, I just need to
stop sharing mine.
Screen. A moment. That. Where's the share screen? So I'm actually modeling something very different here, right? Actually, not very different. So, I take the customer's whole development process and components, and they say we need security, we need security, we want to be more secure. Obviously, that doesn't mean coming in and do a pen test. You want to build out an AppSec program, but you can't do everything at once, right? That's the point of a map. You want to know which battles to fight, right? So that's part of what we're trying to map out here. And there's absolutely going to be conflation here between the parts of the product and different teams. Okay, I'm actually using Dry.io. One thing I love about Dry.io that I haven't seen in other products is layers. They could easily remove a layer and add that back in. So I had to remove most of the actual details. So I have here a bog simple customer and their needs, and the components that add the needs. Right, you have a couple of modules. You have the infrastructure module, which is also software, and then there's a platform, which is moving to Kubernetes, database, whatever. I also mapped out some organizational needs. In order to acquire the customers, we need a good reputation, added value, developer velocity, which is one of the things that the developer teams are always pushing for. More security, but don't slow us down. If it's going to take 20% of our time, forget it. And to do that, one of the needs that you have that driving, you need to have planning around security. And to do that, you need risk management. But we don't actually have that right now in the organization. So that's a very, very non-mature over there. So then from these components, now we can map out the security attributes that we need. Okay, confidentiality, integrity, etc. Most of these are going to be pretty generic. The question is, again, how it's used. So confidentiality, encryption, that's pretty, as a concept, it's very mature. There's very mature algorithms. How it's actually implemented might not be completely 100%. It's not just, it's not completely vigorous. Obviously, compliance is one of those things that is very out of the box. And from there, I'm going to go into two different directions. Number one, I went into the direction of controls. Okay, so we need to actually put on security controls to enforce those attributes. So, for example, we need confidentiality. Then we need to actually build out encryption, and we need to make sure that it's there. It might be that we need to put it there, or it might be that's where it is. So here's where it gets fuzzy between landscape and planning, and so on, and the other controls. And that is something that actually made sense for this client. They might have some things that were very mature, and some things like access control, which as a concept, they're not creating it, but it's still very hand-rolled, they're very customized. Same thing with authentication and so forth. I think most software is going to look something like this. So this is one view, and feel free to jump in and tell me if you think I'm going the wrong direction. The other thing that I put in here is that we know that software is ongoing. It's not a point in time, that's it. By the time we finish doing this Wardley mapping, they already threw out a few more features, right? So we're going to have additional needs that they're meeting, additional functionality, modules. This is something that we're going to need to include also. Additional, security requirements that we want to include in our AppSec program, which we haven't, we don't know what they are yet, but we need to get to them. Zoom bars in the way. Yep. All right. So now I'm going to remove the controls and say, okay, let's talk about the AppSec program, because that's, about the process, the activities, right? That's exactly what we need. And here it gets a little bit more crowded. And I think it was, I forgot who was saying about the colors. Andre was saying about the colors. I made a lot of use of the colors here because there's a world of difference between a software component, right? A security control or an activity that you need to do. So I felt like it was really important to reflect that. I would love to hear a different solution that's more accessible than colors. But here I broke it down to all the different activities. And yeah, we need to do all these activities potentially, but the question is where? And I realized I already have a few, some critique on my own map based on some of the previous sessions. And I realized that, for example, threat modeling, I put over here, some teams were actually more mature around threat modeling. Some teams had none at all. Yep. So I didn't break it down to what they have per se, but more kind of overall where the actual organizational practice actually is. So this is kind of a mix of what they define, what they actually do, and where we want to go. And the last layer, I'm not going to go through each one right now, but it's kind of clear. I think you have your automated code scan, which is pretty mature, but it's kind of a product, right? Vulnerability scan, you off the market, just run a scanner. Dependency analysis is almost a commodity, but not quite, right? And so some of these are the activity around using a product. Okay, it doesn't help if you install, I don't know, checkmarks or Sneak if you don't use it, right? So it's around the process of those of using that. And some of them is straight up, you have to go ahead and manually review your code. You have to go and do threat modeling. And then over here on the left, we have the SDLC, which is almost non-existent there. They were talking about a champions program, or they're starting to work on it, but they don't actually, it's not actually defined, and a few other types of activities that need to be done. And each one of these are traced back to a specific attribute that a specific component needs. Okay, so for example, the platform needs availability and it needs integrity as a platform, right? We don't really care. It doesn't need to provide secrecy of itself. That's at the software level. So basically, as the user needs are dependent on each component has its own requirements, attribute, security requirement, whatever. And each one of these can be validated or ensured by one of these activities. So in this case, I'm not talking about the actual risk as something might go wrong or there's a problem, but more, again, that amorphous, we are flowing security up, right? We're removing that risk, so to speak. And we're literally, by doing threat modeling, code scanning, and all these things, we're literally removing the risk that there will be a confidentiality breach on this component. Okay. And this is the way I was thinking about the AppSec program. And lastly, of course, I can throw on regions, right, which helps me group it together and understand, kind of where these, how the organization can go and tackle a group of things at once. So you have the more mature things over here that just need to be a little bit more, or they just need to be implemented better. And then you have the big Genesis security activities over here that have a lot of work, but that's obviously where you're going to get the most security benefit by pushing all of this over here to the right.
Yep.
Okay. And of course, this also has emergent properties that obviously we have a process around security requirements. We're going to be able to discover the security requirements we don't know about. Okay. And this will drive, of course, all these things, having an SDLC and threat modeling will drive risk management, which will help us drive dev velocity even faster rather than not having it at all. So this is where I was able to show that I'm able to flow security up through the needs and through the components. And again, it helps us pick our battles. We don't have to do it on all the modules at once or all the requirements at once, on the one hand. And it also helps us sell this to the R&D department because, you all had these needs that weren't being met. And this, by doing a little bit more security, you're actually meeting this need of driving developer velocity, which ultimately drives sales.
Yep.
So I already have a lot of criticism on my own map, and this wasn't done that long ago. I think this was one of the first maps that I actually shared with the client. I would love to hear feedback now, and very hard.
Personally, I really, really like it.
Sorry, Mario, go ahead, please.
No, go on.
Sure. Personally, thank you very much for sharing the way that you actually used it to think about things. I wasn't really following when you're talking about colors, but the way that I actually see your map now, I can see how it can actually help to think about the problem. And I must say that I'm quite ignorant about Wardley maps because I did miss the other sessions. I couldn't attend, but I was reading all about it. And the way that I perceive this comes more from a business perspective. And in that sense, and I would just like to share my understanding for you guys to correct me where needed. The way that I actually observe it, I don't see it as easy to achieve the goal that you're looking to achieve in a way that would be easy to transmit to other people without you having to talk them through like you did just now. And the reason for that is that the way that I see it, at least, is that we have 4 swim lanes that are really tied to business maturity. And because of that, the way that you actually position, okay, so you have the value on the top, and then there's the value chain to produce something that will be visible to the customer. I would challenge on the Wardley itself, the word invisible at the end, because I think that everything would be invisible as part of the value chain because they require something tangible or intangible, or otherwise anyway. That is the visible part, so that will always be on the top. But then the placements of all the components that make up the value chain would be the things that you would actually put in place. So I would say, do you actually put an architectural review in something that is not as a business in a swim lane, right? Something that is mature or not mature? Is the code review itself something part of the business? I would think this more towards the components that you could actually apply. So say you're trying to put a firewall or you're putting an IDS, that's something that is a commodity. So you can actually replace it with another one, but you know yourself that they also provide different type of capabilities themselves. And maybe that you prefer a vendor that is a bit more in some space or some sphere of the market that is growing and not a complete commodity, then you position those differently. And me as a business owner or a CEO, pretending that I could be capable of actually being one, would actually look at the diagram and understand, okay, what is the level of risk of accepting a solution that is not proven? But also from a security perspective and learning from what you shared, and I could actually see all of the questioning that arises from looking at a business diagram in that sense. And I see the need of actually coming with all of this. And I like your regions, but I don't think that you could actually come up to something as these oval shapes that you have, because they would actually be in different places. But I do enjoy the way that you thought about it. Now, guys, this is coming, of course, as my first contact towards the Wardley maps, because I would like to grab this and put it to a business owner and say, okay, this is what we're giving the customer. These are the things that we have to go through. These are my concerns. And the way that I would have to narrow it down, probably not as deep as you would, as you have actually demonstrated there, probably due to lack of capacity on my side. I think I would be overwhelming the amount of information that I would be putting there, because it would be not very businessy. Although, you know, whatever sort of security solution that I would put there would actually be helpful. So I'm challenging this because I haven't read enough, but I think that it needs somewhere a way of adding more information to it without necessarily being towards the color schemes or even the shapes.
Thank you for that. I think that you have a lot of good points. One thing I'll point out about adding information to it, you see the little numbers there. Those are like annotations that I actually elaborated in a document, you know, what those are and kind of a project theme, so to speak. And you know, there's a lot of, you know, somebody that's not from security might not know what any of these things are. So I also explained what each of those security activities are. And I want to get back to what you were saying, and this could be where I missed here a little bit, but what I wanted to show was that the security activities are a business activity. They are a business need. And I'm trying to trace that back, you know, so the top part is really like a business Wardley map, right? It's the software. And I want to show, you know, I'm not sure at what level I succeeded here, but I'm trying to show, I'm trying to trace that back. So any one of these activities can contribute upwards, and there's a flow of, you know, quote unquote security, which offers validation for that requirement. And that requirement actually relates back to a certain value there, which obviously meets the user need. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I understood that. The lower the level, it actually would be like steps that you need to complete. I was thinking more this, like if you grab ITIL, for example, and you have to, you know, specify the process or whatever, or a specific process. Then you have to narrow down and characterize all of the things that need to happen, you know, for order to actually be able to deliver. And this would actually be a way of creating a diagram towards that. But the way that, you know, when I was hearing you guys, you know, throwing security at this and how do we actually think about it, I also saw the need of creating like a kind of a mind map of what you have here to facilitate that work. but then the placement of itself inside of the graphic, it makes sense if I would be listening to you, but my interpretation would always be different in terms of the keywords that you're using and the placements that you have in the swim lanes. And that was the bit that I was challenging, you see. So
which is one of the points of the map, right?
I'll give you an example. So just grabbing, by chance, thread modeling there on the swim lane on line 2. When I would be interpreting this, I don't recall, but Mario was sharing the template where there was the relation to the business maturity level. And I would be looking at this thinking, right, are you thinking of grabbing a solution to do the threat modeling that is not mature, that is not a commodity? Why did you actually place it there? And then I'll probably have to come back to you and ask you that question. See, so the placement itself does not answer the question of, okay, what is the risk involved of the threat modeling here or being here, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to preface that like that's one of the points of this map that, that you can challenge that, and let's actually discuss it and flesh that out. Specifically about the threat modeling, that's a really great question, because there are two vectors that I kind of obfuscated here. I mentioned one that, different teams might be doing this differently. And I kind of squeezed everything into a single map instead of breaking this out on a per team map. I'm not sure that would have been better in this regard, because you want to build an AppSec program for everybody and have each team adapt it to it. So that's one thing I'm not even sure about. As far as why is threat modeling right there? Let's take a single team. Let's say it's right there. Why is it there? And I think that's a great challenge there. I did have to take the different phases, and if you notice, the words that I have here on the bottom are not Simon's standard words. It still matches those characteristics that he laid out for the different phases, but because I'm trying to understand how to apply this as a security requirement, right, and not exactly like a capability. To understand how to apply that. So, what is threat modeling? Is threat modeling a person sitting down and spending 3 days doing a stride matrix? Is it threat modeling as code? Is it running? It can be a lot of different things, and you're absolutely right about that. And I would need at this point to explain what I actually mean by doing threat modeling. When I say you need to do more threat modeling here, what actually is that?
I was thinking of having a suggestion, because I do like the regions, but I would probably, increase the vertical space of the diagram itself and use the software development lifecycle and apply it then. Maybe it would make more sense. And I'm challenging myself already on what I just said, because there might be some overlap, in terms of iteration or otherwise in some of the activities, but it will probably be easier to interpret it, and you could probably have it all in the same swim lane.
I don't understand how you meant to make it taller?
Yeah, pretty much.
Right. So at some point, run out of space because there's a lot of software components. I trimmed this down to a couple of modules, right? And there's actually a lot of stuff around there because you want to model that out too, so you know which battles to be picking. So at some point, I kind of just ran out of space. You're right. I could have just made zoomed in and made it taller. Yeah. But the fact that there is overlap, I think that is partly, at least for me, in my thinking, it's by design. Take a look at code review over here, right? Code review, what is code review? It's actually we need code review to be done. And there's two main ways of getting it done. You can do it automated, you can do it manual. And their evolution is completely different. The way of doing it is completely different, but they all serve the same rubric of having your code reviewed. So the fact that there's overlap, I'm okay with that.
On that specific one, I would challenge only that you would place it in different life cycle. So one as part of development, and maybe the automated one would be something that you pour more towards the release. But I see your point. I do understand. And that particular one, I think, would be resolved. But something like secure coding, that is part of the requirements as well, and then it would be part of the development, and then it would be at the end. So I see the challenge as well.
Yeah, no, all that makes sense. By the way, I'm going to challenge you about SDLC, because here I'm talking about more about the practice of having, the overall SDLC irrelevant of the specific activities under it. So yeah, SDLC obviously is connected to secure coding, but in and of itself is also its own thing. So the fact that you could challenge each one of these activities, if it's more mature, if it's more important, has a larger effect. I think that's a great thing. The question is this idea of a model, does it really make sense? And is this a good way of representing? And my obfuscation, how bad is my obfuscation here?
Yeah. So there's a few things, and you try to deal with some problems that I've grappled with and I'm still grappling with. So the main challenge that I see with that approach is that you end up having to tie a lot of those types of activities directly to a technical component, which may or may not be a good view into the issue, right? Because I think those are all kind of, they hang off of components, right? When they are actually organizational practices that affect the components, but not the other way around.
How do you mean?
So all of those things at the bottom, they are organizational activities, right? So what is their relationship exactly with the components? Is it the same across all of them? Are we saying that module one, all of the modules in the platform and the database, they all get the same benefit out of that service?
Well, that's kind of the point. I mean, yes, ideally, it would be everyone. Realistically, probably won't be even.
Yeah.
That said, you know, but when we're thinking about the flow of security value, which is hard to quantify or even be specific about what it is, but I think it's very clear to us what we're talking about, flowing security value. Any of the components that would use any one of these services would get that benefit, and anything that relies on the component would get that benefit as well. For example, you know, if we have a core infrastructure module, right? If we do full threat modeling and security analysis and do everything on that infrastructure, then that absolutely does lower the risk for all the components that rely on it. You might want to do it without the front-end components as well, but you've already massively reduced your inherent risk.
Yep.
So the fact that, I mean, so I understand. I'm still not sure about what I did. Also,
yeah. So I've got a similar map, but the problem is because I couldn't address the problem that I've asked the question to. So that's why I was asking the problem. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, I'm gonna stop sharing. So I mean, you know, the fact that it's hanging off, so to speak, is kind of by design, and that helps each of those teams visualize, you know, how it affects them and where they, and let the VP R&D, for example, optimize where to infect. Let's say we can't do the infrastructure module.
Yep.
Let's do some other thing.
Yep. So I don't, it probably was a bad thinking from me. I do have it, but I would need to anonymize it. I can share on the Wardley mapping later because I've done a risk modeling thing for a customer, but I can't share it now because I'd be sharing customer stuff and I won't do that for obvious reasons. But I'm going to take the information of the customer and then I'll share on the Wardley mapping channel. But I think I'm starting to kind of see a silver lining or a way forward, perhaps. The idea, does everyone understand the idea of risk modeling? Right. So the basic idea of risk modeling, let me see if Google is very happy with me, makes me very happy on my first try. Right, not, yes, here it is. So in SABSA, we have this thing of risk modeling. It's one of the techniques within the framework. So what we do there is that we think of the different types of domains of risk that exist, and we think about the relationships between those domains. And usually these domains are tied to business attributes. Okay, so what I mean by that is that we get to something that looks like, sorry, I'm sure I've got a slide with like this. Okay, so basically I've got this is the the different subset layers, and we start with business attributes at the top, which you can have different types of layers to, and then we define what are the security services. So, and these are are usually things that the security team does for the business, but it can also include things that other teams have agency for. Right? So, for instance, this OS security provisioning type stuff may not necessarily be something that the security team does, but that the DevOps, whatever you want to call it, team have, but it's a security service within the organization. Okay, and we've got this really clear structure between what are the different security goals, what are the services that are being provided by the organization, how that translates into security mechanisms. So what we do to deliver that service, and then it's on the bottom layer that we actually have standards, we actually have technology, that we actually have the processes. Okay, and this is kind of a standard way of looking through a layered approach to what it means to the organization. Going back to this type of thing, basically what I've done for a few of my customers is think, for instance, at the top, when we've got here the reputable or trusted risk, that translates into, for instance, enabling time to market as a business goal, translates into automated as a security service, a security goal, which in my security service relates to application in the OS security provisioning, which in this instance, I use Ansible to perform that. And then I've got my Nginxes and my Linux CIS benchmark, right? That's my security component. Right? It's kind of what you were doing, Avi, but kind of with a, yeah, it's kind of it's very similar. What it doesn't do is tie back to it did tie back to attributes, but you had a component view of the attribute, while subset typically gives you an organizational view of the attribute, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. But with your experience coming to, a development organization with that, you said, I don't know, organizational view, we need confidentiality. That doesn't really make sense from a software perspective, right?
Depends how you translate that security goal into services that need to be provided. Right. So, for instance, if confidentiality for you means a store data confidentiality, it may mean 20 other security services that you mean in transit. It may mean you are the one defining the services that that would make sense to you in your context. I think I've got
Yep. That's why you need to trace it back just to maybe I'm missing something about subset, and I know I'm missing a lot about subset. That's why I'd see to trace it back to some extent to the component or to the need in some way to say, because it's not just everything needs to be secret, but this part of the data needs to be secret or that needs to be secret. Right?
Yep. So there is here an example. Yes. So this is a potential, a typical view of how to structure services, which is you can have a compliance service, confidentiality services, and then inside each of these boxes, then it relates to actual mechanisms that are used, and then at the lower layer, the actual tools and technologies and whatever else that you want to do. And there's a cloud version of this. Actually, there's a very good blog post that I'm sure I can find on First Find. I typically do, which is subset application security. Here it is, using subset for application security, where this gentleman has done this type of traceability, right? And then it relates to actual requirements, and he lives in this in the actual so logical services. At logical layer, it's the services. Physical, it's the mechanisms, and the components are the actual technologies or technical things that we're using. And this all ties back what I've never found a way to. So this is kind of the direction I always wanted to go, but I never found an effective way to then translate this or to overlay this on top of components on a map. but I also had never thought about using layers in the modeling thing. Maybe that's the way to go, because I think the challenge is that these things relate more at the organizational level, as you did. So, for instance, when I've built the map of security mapping, which I have here, I also use that idea of separating the organization from the stuff above, right? And it does, so the scope is measuring prioritize business risk and security as enabler as compliance. And it has a number of stuff on adding value to core business, the business attributes, which are these things that we're talking about now, and then how that relates to other aspects of engineering, assurance, and protecting relationships, trust, and brand. But I think all of these pieces are parts to the puzzle. I don't know what's the best way to actually put the puzzle together.
Let's see if anybody else wants to chime in.
Yep.
So Avi, really like the map. From a risk perspective, it felt like it was another aspect of risk, more focused on the controls or the security assurance activities and where they sit. Initially with the map that Mario put up, we were talking around the value chain and the risks to the risks inherent with the business processes or the components used within the Wardley map. Where with your one, we switched to focusing on effectively controls or assurance activities that can mitigate risks, which feels like it's both valid, just another dimension to the risk mapping. And it almost feels like on the other side, we would have the threats or the scenarios that attach to the business process, and then the controls that fit to it. That's exceedingly high level, but does that make sense?
Yes, it does, and that's really the problem that at least I have been having for a long time, which is so using this example, this is a business value chain, right? I can then very easily create something like this that tells me the security stuff, but they should be meeting somewhere, right? And how to portray that that this meets there is non-trivial.
Yeah, the thing that I don't like so much about the map you have right now, I mean, it's sensible. I mean, I feel like it's something that Gartner would put out, you know? I mean, it's generically speaking, it makes a lot of sense. It helps you understand where all these activities play in. But it says nothing about what I need to do to make my application more secure or my team's build more secure. Right?
But it does talk about, this is not meant to respond to that question. It's meant to respond to what business attributes are my security services supporting, right? And what is the structure of that support?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I used to joke with about different views of the world. So yeah, you would have the architect's view of the world, developers' view of the world, compilers' view of the world, and processors' view of the world. Each change, and with your map, Avi, it is very focused on the software. It's software architecture centric, and it's security assurance activity centric that can reduce risks relative to that. Which is great, because that's kind of how I think. I also, from Mario's side, the view from SABSA is another view of that. How do we put them all together?
Sarah, I think you were going to say something. I'd love to hear your thoughts after hearing these two types of views as well.
Yeah, I think the looking through different lenses thing is precisely this. I think we need to nail who our customer is and what they most need to hear. I know that sounds like such a simplistic thing to say, but when we very much first started, very much in the spirit that Simon teaches the intro, my gut feeling was that people want to know, have we got the right security controls for the kind of risk environment we're living in? And B, if we've got them, are they doing the job? Are we capable of them doing the job? Are they capable of doing the job, and are we using them to do the job? Those were the things that I was thinking we need to try and represent, rather than necessarily trying to, we could and scaling the relative importance of different things that might not be optimal right now or might be missing. That's the problem statement that I'm trying to, that's not a problem statement, but that's the communication, the message I'm trying to address. And I can see we're getting towards it, and my brain is just ticking over at 100 miles an hour without being able to offer you any answers at all right now.
Yeah. So, because I think a lot of the view that Avi was showing, I think those are definitely things that help reduce risk if you're adding all of those controls and doing all of those activities, but they tell nothing about the about risk, right? They talk about controls. Risk it's about the event, it's about the potential consequences. It's and that is only slightly related to how many controls you can put on top of the thing, right?
I completely agree with that. And that's one of the things that I realized shortly after doing this map, that I was lacking that risk value equation. For example, when I was mapping out the user needs and the software components, I ignored security altogether, just how they evolved they are from a software evolution concept and how much value they provide. I think it would have been smarter to invoke some consideration of risk there, and I'm not sure, but I'm leaning towards thinking that it should be on the value axis, something that is inherently more risk. And it's something we started talking about yesterday, and Phil told me I was calling it risk wrong. Not about the potential incident or vulnerability, but about the potential impact that might be there, right?
Yep.
How much, again, if I'm storing 1 million credit card, then that is inherently more not risk than whatever you want to call it, rather than a list of cat pictures.
Yep.
And I think that needs to be invoked there. I don't think it's completely ignored here, because obviously the more value it has to the user or to the organization, obviously the more risk impact there might be on that component. And there's definitely a flow here. Again, the infrastructure, if I can take over the platform, for example, distribution of that, obviously everything above that, all that risk, or forget risk, lack of security flows up.
Yep.
So yeah, I wasn't actually trying to map out where the actual risks or threats or attacks will be, but rather where I need to pay attention to.
Yeah, but that's actually a good question. A comment that leads to another part, which we haven't said out loud, which is, for instance, if we were talking about what it takes to build these types of systems, and we were to have, let's say, the platform over here, right? So if this element gets compromised and everyone uses, the blast radius is huge, because it's going to affect all of the value chains that operate on top of it, right?
I love
so
blast
that
radius.
Sorry?
I love blast radius.
Yeah.
That's for exactly what.
Yeah, and that was kind of what I was trying to portray with these thicker arrows, right? That there's if this go, I don't know if I got if that kind of gets the message across in the right way, but if the things that are usually further down the value chain, they tend, not necessarily, but they tend to be shared by more value chains, at least when we're talking IT stuff. So an impact, something that impacts them, will have always a much bigger impact across the organization, or and potentially have more of of a business impact overall.
I've tried to articulate that before as well. When I've been addressing the weaknesses in current risk models, quite separate from mapping, it's that you know, is a weak password really a problem? Well, it depends what it's a weak password for. And if you're looking at compromised systems, is it your web app that does something very discrete, or is it your Unix layer on which you've got your entire Oracle estate sitting? And you know, it's those whole layers of infrastructure right down to tin and boxes and wires. At which layer in the matrix is it? So the only answer I can come up with is drillability. If you're going to try and represent through a lens that's both understandable and useful to more than one audience, you're going to have to build different maps. And if you want to relate them to each other, we're going to have to find a smart way of drilling them or connecting them from one slide to the next. I think it's a fool's errand to try and represent it all on one screen.
Yep, I think I would agree. And another thing with which is kind of what you just said, but kind of said in a different way. The challenge with potentially focusing on views such as Avi's one, when we're trying to relate back to the value chains, is that we don't get it's very difficult to get a sense of what's appropriate, right? So going back to your example, password being good or bad, it depends on what it's protecting, right? And the challenge with having that the wider view on all of the controls and all of the activities that we do is that we don't get that sense of appropriateness, right? Do I have enough control? Right? Or am I having overcooking the controls that I need in some places and potentially undercooking it in others? Whatever we do for representing risk should provide us with a view of if we're doing enough or not.
I'm getting my crayons out and a big piece of paper after this, I think.
I think that comes back to blast radius. Obviously, the lower down the value chain it is, the less visible to the user, the more of an infrastructure platform it is, right? The bigger blast radius it will have, even if the user isn't directly seeing it.
Yep.
And you know that I think there's that interaction between the value flow and the risk flow or the security flow. And I think it comes back. I think it's key what Sarah said, that you know each view, each type of map could be perfectly valid in different situations, and trying to understand risk flow or security flow as its own thing out of context of what we're using it for doesn't work. There's not a single representation that will make sense in all these different types of security maps, right?
Yep. So I think the part that you did on your map, on all of those activities, etc., I think it would be a brilliant submap on something relating to risk. But because that's kind of telling you about your control landscape and how evolved that is. But it would be a contributor to it. It's probably a fourth of the overall risk thing.
I would even see it as a submap of software development management, because that's really where I was aiming for it anyway, trying to help the dev managers understand what security they need and why. And you know, you can talk to them about risk and security, and that's not what actually drives their business, right? That's not what drives their day to day, and that's why I connected the organizational needs back to the development velocity and things like developing new features and basically selling the product. And very little does security or risk interest them, only in as much as it might affect one of the other value that they have.
Yep. But that's what I was getting to with this risk modeling, right? Because this is where you can define at the high level what are the business attributes that are relevant to the organization, such as the enabling time to market, etc. And then you think about the security attributes that contribute to that high level attribute in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think we're basically doing the same thing with a different view.
Yeah, right? Exactly. But I would love to know how to connect them, but it's evading me. But I mean, this is.
But maybe we don't need to connect them because they have different purposes. They're used for different things, different audience. I think that they each need to stretch a little bit more in each other's direction, maybe some overlap.
Yep.
I don't think any one of these is complete or even good enough yet.
Yep.
And I think there needs to be some more, I don't know, meshing between them.
Yeah. But the idea of these goals is that, for instance, this reputable would be kind of a bigger container where where protected would be inside of it, and then the protected would include authenticated and malware free, right? So this is kind of this is just a representation, but they actually live inside of each other. So something that would affect the authenticated property ultimately affects at the bigger box from an organizational perspective, affects reputable.
But again,
can you put reputable as a component?
Where?
So, sorry, you go ahead.
There you go. I've been talking too much anyway.
I was just asking because the way that I was looking at this, the last layer of the subset that you have there, they're all components, and I was trying to actually grab those and applying it to the Wardley map that you were showing. So let's look at the server room, for example. You need to split that because the security components will be part of the value chain and they need to be represented somewhere inside of the server room. So, you make your diagram have a lot more choices. And then if you go for CrowdStrike or a solution like what they offer, they can actually be in different layers. But now I've noticed also something different, and now questioning, that the swim lanes here are different names. So they had Genesis and I forget the other three. They weren't as business specific as the one that Miro were offering, because the way that I was looking at it from the beginning was more businessy. And here I would then position it. I think the second one was custom, wasn't it?
Yeah. So it's Genesis, custom built, product / rental, and commodity / utility.
Commodity is something that you can buy off the shelves and reuse. So why not apply the security, the last layer? It doesn't communicate as much as you want, and I understand that as being the problem. But you would say exactly what are the security components that need to be there in order to provide value. Just the last layer.
Yeah, this last layer?
Yeah.
On to here, for instance.
For example, yeah.
Okay, let's explore that. Oh, it's already 7. I probably have another 5 minutes before I start having marital issues. So that's a good idea. So we would think, for instance, let's change the color of this. Let's put it on.
Now, leaning on what Avi was saying, while you were discussing, on the blast radios part of it, where would you place those in terms of more to the left, more to the right, further up, further down? Because that would be interesting as well.
I'm not sure I followed. Could you repeat that, please?
Sure. So let's say that you're applying TLS to the server room.
Yeah.
The impact of that being compromised somehow, being represented in the graphic itself and diagram itself, and the way that you position it on the diagram, further up or further down, will be, related towards the level of compromise in terms of the blast radius itself.
Okay, so you're saying using the y-axis
Exactly.
as to represent movement of risk.
Yeah. Also, yeah, because we were discussing and we were agreeing, I think, that the further down, the bigger the blast radius.
Yes.
So the challenge then, and this is me challenging what I'm saying, is the positioning of it inside of the bigger graphic, right? Because yes, if TLS is compromised on the server room and that affects everything above it, then that's severely, that's bad. Let's put it that way. But if you compromise, I don't know, what else did you have on your diagram? RBAC
Yeah,
on the access
RBAC.
control. How bad would that be compared against the compromise of TLS? You know, a misconfiguration on TLS or something like that.
Yep.
And represent that on the y-axis. So the further up or down would also have the risk of the risk level represented in the graphic itself.
Yeah, that's an idea. So generally, in Wardley mapping, so Simon Wardley says that the y-axis is scaffolding, right? That he only basically it was because people were asking questions that he to make it easy for people to start mapping. That's why he thought of visibility to represent the y-axis, but it's scaffolding. Right, it doesn't really mean much, generally speaking, but this would be a way potentially to make it mean something. Because in reality, if we were to have a breach, sorry, this thing is always coming up. If we were to have a breach on this component, I can consider it being further down on my value chain because the customers don't care. But suddenly, if this is hacked, my board will care very much. It will probably be the top of their agenda.
Indeed, but the way that I see it is that what you're serving, who's your user, right? So in this particular case, the sales team. And if you're looking at from a user perspective on the value, which is in green, the manager-customer relationship, that will be impacted anyway. So all of the construction, the value chain itself, all the construction that goes into delivering that particular service or product will be affected. So the further down, the bigger the impact. We are debating if that can be the case, using the y-axis for it. But the value that you add in terms of all of the security components that you have on your SAPSO layer can actually be represented there, I think. And you could probably transmit more information on it by positioning it differently, vertically still. In terms of risk, in terms of the Genesis custom and product rental also as well, because you can grab something that is already tested in, your TLS or your CrowdStrike, or, you're actually leaning towards changing your value chain and applying a different product that is a bit more customized or more product. And you can also represent it in the same diagram, making it reusable. So not to start the process all over again. The bit that I'm loving about this is the level of discussion that you can actually have and the different ways that people are actually using it.
Yep.
There's a lot of value.
Yeah, that's the beauty of mapping. Yeah. So yeah, I don't think we progressed much, but I will want to watch this again and see if we can generate some further conversation on this. So this is not something that anyone has addressed yet. This is really exploration, but I think there's so overall, I think we ended up exploring the risk to the value chain. We walked through a different type of visualizations from Avi and from myself on how to do it. We talked about a few possibilities of representing it now with Andre. That Andre mentioned potentially the security components, overlaying them. Or not overlaying them, but representing the controls that apply to them, right? I'm still not sure how that would affect risk, but yeah, it's just the control part, so it's not the kind of the whole story. But yeah, so there's a lot more exploration to be done in this space. But it was a very good conversation on separating the components being used when we are using commodities or not, and then all of the activities as they emerge as well.
I do want to point out you were talking about mapping the risk and all that, which is great for for the CISO and risk managers, but that isn't necessarily helpful to the development team, which is the view that I was taking. So I think we all. I learned a lot from here, just sharing a lot of different ideas. But I think the biggest thing is it comes back to the purpose of the map and the audience.
Yep. No, I agree. And even on that was what I discussed as well here when I did this talk last week, right? is that when we're talking with knowledge workers, with the people actually doing the work, we need techniques such as threat modeling, because that's what they understand, and they know what they can do in the next couple of months in talking to them about risk, which has a lot more uncertainty and much bigger time lapse between when someone makes a decision and when it can actually materialize. Then we need different type of techniques such as risk management and looking at the wider piece. That's where Wardley Mapping and Cynefin come into play.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate appreciate this, and thanks Dida. I think she dropped off already, for putting this together so quickly.
Yep. Thank you, Alona.
Thanks very much.
You're still with us? Yes.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. It was a great one. We had an awesome conversation, right?
Yep.
It was great exchanges. Well, it turned out to be a great session. So I'm going to end this live, and then later after this, we're going to have the debrief or the wrap up.